Hello, welcome back to Learn to Knit. We're making a block afghan. We're going to learn another block today, but I want to teach you how to weave in your ends because I haven't mentioned that yet. And we should have a tail at the beginning of each block and a tail at the end of each block. We need to do something with those because we don't want them on our afghan. When we turn our afghan over, we want it to be just as nice on the back as it is on the front. And so I think the easiest way to weave in our ends for this block afghan project is to run our tails along the edges of the block where the tails already are. You should have a tail in a corner, and we're knitting these so that they're 7 inches across by 9 inches high. So I think if you've got an end in a corner, the neatest way and most effective way is to weave the end the long way of the block, along that edge, the side edge of the blocks. Now, let me discuss needles for a second. We've got various types of needles here. Here's one with a very, very small eye, and it's quite sharp. It's very, very sharp. This is probably one of my favorites. It's all personal choice, but I like it because it's narrow, and I'm not going to distort my fabric too much. This one has a wider eye. See if we can get a good shot of that. So it's much, much easier to get your yarn in there. And the best way I have found for yarn or embroidery floss, lots of things that have little edges, tips that maybe sometimes fray, loop your yarn over it just a little bit and squeeze it tight. And then you can put your yarn through the eye much, much easier because you're not going to have all those little bits going every which way. This is another type of needle that I like a lot. It's got a larger eye, but you'll see it's bent. It's got a bent tip. And when you're going through stitches to weave in ends or seams to sew a sweater together, it's nice to have kind of that hook, so you're kind of going in, not straight through, but sort of just skimming the surface sometimes, if that makes sense. Give this a try. I think you'll like it. But if you've just got the other needles on hand, tapestry needles, darning needles, anything that's got an eye large enough to get the yarn through, that's good for weaving in ends. Generally for seaming, I like a more blunt tip. But when it comes to weaving in ends, I like the tip of the needle to be pretty sharp. And the reason for that is I want to be kind of messy when I'm weaving in my end. We don't like to split our yarn at all. But when you're weaving in an end, especially with wool, it's very, very helpful. It helps all the little fibers, the hairs, sort of cling to each other, and it makes it more sturdy. And it's also maybe a little bit less visible. Now, the purpose of weaving in the end is obviously so we don't have these long tails. So if you just ran your length of tail through, what some people like to do is sort of overlap it as they're knitting along. But what that does is it just has the tail going in one direction. What we want to do is prevent that tail from moving, and the easiest way is to make it change direction. The tails can't change direction. So if you tug on a sweater or an afghan, you can pull one direction out. But if the tail is going the other direction and maybe looping back a second time or a third time, that will prevent it from migrating. So the easiest way to do that is to go in different directions either straight or on a diagonal. Some people like to go in a diagonal form. For these blocks, what I have been doing, and this is the block that we're going to learn today, you will notice on the edge, you've got kind of these little knots. They're not knots really, it's just where the yarn has overlapped. Let's see if I can get a good shot of that. Do you see these? They're sort of like a purl bump, you know, on the edge. I find if I take the yarn through and then do a back stitch, which means I'm going backwards and then through again, where that little, we'll call it a knot, where the edge knot is. If I do a back stitch and then go through some more and do another back stitch and go through some more and do another back stitch, it's in the edge. So you're not going to see it in the overall block, either on the front or the back. And it's not that intrusive that it's going to be in our way when we seam these together. So that's what I've been doing. I've been sneaking my yarn along the edge. Now you could go all the way down. That's a little bit of overkill. You don't need it that much. Usually, if you go through about 3 or 4 stitches, turn or do a back stitch, go through another 3 or 4 stitches, maybe do that one more time, that's ample. That's ample. And when you're doing a sweater that has a lot of texture, now first of all, let me just say, when you're knitting a sweater, you don't want to run out of yarn right center front. You want to change your yarn when you're running low on yarn. You want to make that change at an edge so that you can hide it in the seam. But you know, say something happened and the yarn worked itself free and you need to darn in the center of a sweater, you know, something like that. You want to do it as invisibly as possible. So try a bunch of methods. See what works best for you. But I have found in these blocks, doing the back stitch along the edge worked best for me. And there are a lot of tutorials on YouTube for weaving in ends. Another thing that hopefully we'll get to is duplicate stitch. Duplicate stitch is when you take a fabric, usually it's the stockinette stitch, and you will take a contrasting color and you will work that stitch again with a needle and thread. So it's basically sewing a duplicate of the knit stitch on a sweater to form a pattern. Say you've got a little girl's sweater and you want to duplicate stitch a little flower on it. It's nice for things like that. So when you're weaving in ends, that's a technique that some people use too, to duplicate stitch the ends in. So you're following the path of the knit stitch or the purl stitch using a needle and thread. But I find that to be a little bit bulky. So it's great when you're doing a flower or a sailboat or, you know, whatever kind of design you want to duplicate stitch. You want that to be seen. That's your artwork. It's embroidery, basically. You're embroidering on top of a finished garment. It can be one you knit or one that you store bought. You want it to be seen, and usually it's in a different color, obviously. So you want that to stand out. When we're weaving in ends, though, we don't want it to stand out. So having that additional layer of yarn on top of your fabric is something we want to avoid. So work into the edges, work into the seams as much as you can. But I hope you'll have fun weaving in the ends. It's a task that a lot of people don't care for. I've knit this sweater, I've knit this scarf, I've knit this blanket, and now I've got 1,000 ends to weave in. Do them a little bit at a time. So you should have a nice accumulation of some blocks. Sit down for the afternoon and try different methods and see which you prefer, which works for you, which is the most invisible, because that's the key. You want it to be invisible and you want the end not to escape. Now, I want to show you something that I bought. Aren't these cool? These are my new little scissors that I bought, and they're pretty sharp. I bought them for my embroidery and counted cross stitch. They're really cute. I just bought them on Amazon. But scissors are fun. I've only had, I think, three pairs of scissors for my stitching the whole time that I've been stitching, and I just thought, I want something. I've got my quilting scissors in with my quilting, and I've got my knitting scissors in with my knitting, and my counted cross stitch scissors in with my counted cross stitch. Sometimes I've just got a project and my scissors are all tucked away in their respective baskets, so I wanted another pair of scissors just so that I would have them out. But the reason why I'm mentioning scissors is when you're done weaving in an end, what you'll want to do is cut very, very close so you don't see the end. Don't do that. Leave a little tiny bit because your yarn is probably going to retract back into the fabric a little bit over time. But if it's too close, it could pop out to the front of the work. And then you'll have a little, a 32nd of an inch or a 16th of an inch sticking out. And you don't want that. So if the yarn is going to travel a little bit and kind of nestle itself in, you want it to be able to do that. So avoid the temptation of clipping everything really, really close. And I'll say another thing too. If you've knit a sweater, or, a handy way of getting really nice wool is to go to a charity shop and buy a wool sweater and rip it out. And then you've got nice wool that you can work again. Well, when you weave in ends really, really well, and then you want to rip something out that's already been sewn or the ends woven in, it's very hard sometimes, to see where that end is. So if you've got a little hint of an end that's showing on the back, sometimes that can be a good thing too. So let me show you today's block. This is going to look like another rib, but it's not. Well, it's stretchy this way, but it's not as stretchy this way as a rib. This is a definite pattern. It's not really a rib, although it kind of looks like one. This is a slipped stitch pattern. And I know this pattern as a shaker pattern. I have a picture of a shaker sweater that I took when I was at Hancock Shaker Museum a few years ago. If you've never been there in Western Massachusetts, it's a wonderful, wonderful place to go. It's where the Shakers lived and worked, and it's all restored, and I had a delightful day between the gardens and the houses and just the total ambiance. But the Shakers were known for working hard, but not doing work that they didn't need to do. And so when they knit sweaters, they made sweaters that were quick to knit, but warm, utilitarian, and this was the pattern that they devised that would be easy and warm. There's a little bit of texture to it. So texture traps the air and keeps you warmer when you're knitting sweaters. So a flat stockinette stitch sweater, this colorful sweater, this is a Dale of Norway design that I did many, many years ago. We have snow today, and it's I was out shoveling this morning, and it's a nestle in with a really warm sweater kind of a day. But this is all flat. This is knit and stockinette stitch. So this sweater is not going to keep you as warm as a highly textured sweater, the Aran knits, anything like that, because it's not trapping as much air. So what the Shakers devised was this pattern that knits as quickly as stockinette stitch, but it traps a little bit of air. That's what I was led to believe anyway. And what this is the pattern starts with a knit stitch. And then what we're going to do to get this nice pattern is we're going to slip a stitch. And all that means is you knit a stitch with the yarn in the back. You keep the yarn in the back, but with your needle, you slip the next stitch from the left-hand needle to the right-hand needle by working purlwise. And all that means is you're going to insert your needle from back to front, just like you're doing a purl stitch, but you're not bringing the yarn in front. You're keeping the yarn in back. You're just slipping the stitch, and it's a very, very nice motion. So you just knit, slip, you know, it's easy. The reason why we're slipping it purl-wise is because we don't want to twist the stitch. So if you're ever going through instructions and it says to slip a stitch, if you are just slipping it to go from one side of the work to the other side of the work because you're going to manipulate it in some way on the next row, you want to do it purl-wise. That will not twist the stitch. However, if you're decreasing, we haven't gotten to decreases yet, if you're decreasing a stitch, you want to slip that stitch knitwise. And what that means is you are using your motion to go from front to back. You slip it that way, that does twist the stitch, because there is a decrease that's known as an SSK, or a slip slip knit. What you do is you slip a stitch, then you slip another stitch, then you work those stitches together. So when you're slipping the stitches, you want to twist the stitches, because on the next motion, the knit, you are pretty much untwisting them to get your decrease so that it's what you want. So when you're slipping these stitches, you can slip one knitwise and see how that looks. It'll give you a twisted stitch, and that's something entirely different. So for right now, all you need to do is knit one, slip a stitch purl-wise, knit three, slip another stitch, knit three, slip another stitch, all the way across the row to the final stitch, which is a knit one. So in the instructions in the description box, I will put the knit one, asterisk, slip one, knit three. Repeat that to the end of the row, except we're not knitting 3 stitches at the end of the row, we're only knitting 1. So what I have put is end knit 1. So if you've ever got a pattern that you repeat, but then the stitch count at the very end is different, it will usually say end 2 or end 1 or end 5, something like that. So we have learned another block. We have learned how to weave in our ends, and we've learned how to understand more knitting instructions. So I'd say that's a good day. So I hope you'll give this block, you know, a whirl. It's a fun one, and it goes very, very quickly. The wrong side, you just purl. So the only thing we're doing is, instead of knitting this stitch, we're slipping it. So that's even less work. So it's easier than stockinette stitch. So thank you for joining me. I hope you're enjoying your blanket. I hope you're learning a lot. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I'd be happy to answer them. Have a good day, and I'll see you next time with another fun block.